All right. Welcome to the final Northern Grapes Project webinar. My name is Alex Caberly, and I'm a program assistant for the Northern Grapes Project. Thank you for tuning in today. Today's webinar is introducing Itasca, Minnesota's newest cold hardy white wine grape, with Matt Clark and John and Jennifer Thull. Matt Clark is an assistant professor of grape breeding and Enology at University of Minnesota. His research focuses on traditional and molecular plant breeding techniques to develop improved cold hardy grape varieties for wine production. The Clark Lab also studies the genetics behind resistance to common grape pests such as powdery mildew, phylloxera, downy mildew, and black rot. Jennifer Thull is a gardener, and John Thull is a research professional for the Grape Breeding and Enology program as well at the University of Minnesota. Remember that as a participant in the webinar, we ask that you keep microphones muted if you have them. If you are having any technical difficulties, please type a note in the chat bar over to the bottom right side of your screen, and I'll do what I can to help you. If you have questions, please type them in the chat bar as well. We'll have a question and answer session after the presentation today, and feel free to type in your questions anytime if you have them, making sure that you set your chat bar to send to everyone. Although the 5-year Northern Grapes project concluded in August 2016, we have been able to continue with the Northern Grapes webinar series through this May, thanks to all these generous industry donations. Now I'd like to turn it over to Matt Clark for today's presentation.
All right, good morning. Thanks, Alex, for that introduction. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep, I can hear you fine, and you are now the presenter.
Oh, terrific. Well, thanks for inviting us to talk about Itasca. And again, John Thull and Jenny Thull, who are the folks who work in the vineyard here at Minnesota, are also going to join in the conversation at different parts. And we'll be happy to answer any questions towards the end. Kind of excited about this new variety. And as will become clear, we've grown this only at a few test locations around the country. We've got quite a few vines and have been growing it for a number of years here at Minnesota. And so we're excited to start getting feedback from people in the next year or two as they're planting these vines across the United States. Well, without further ado, let's get on with the show. So I'd like to start at the beginning and really acknowledge the plant breeders who are involved with this project, Dr. Jim Luby and Peter Hempstead, who are really critical in developing the wine industry here in the Midwest, especially in Minnesota, for developing wine cultivar-specific varieties, starting with Frontenac and then most recently with Itasca. There's also a much larger crew who has been involved with the development of this variety, ranging from people who work in our filing patents and getting the data to do that, like Penny Aguirre, to the enologists who've worked on the project, Nick Smith, Katie Cook, Drew Horton, Brian Forbes. We have John and Jenny, of course, who are pictured here, in addition to others who help manage the intellectual properties like Ann Hall, BJ Hahn, Tom Hutton. And then I'm new to this project. I came in almost 2 years ago as a project lead and kind of picking up the ball and started to move forward with the commercialization process and getting information out to the public, which is what we're hoping to do today. So a little background on Itasca. This was a cross that was made in 2002 between Frontenac Gris, which most people listening in today are familiar with, which is a mutant of Frontenac, and then another selection that had been in evaluation at that time, MN1234. So that cross was made in 2002. Those plants were grown out for several years and evaluated, and in 2009, that's when Peter Hempstead made the selection for this grape to advance it from being just a seedling in a nursery row to giving it a numbered accession. And at that point in time, it became known as MN1285 or 1285. And so if you've listened to our presentations or been looking at data, we've been referring this to 1285 until last year, where it got the name Itasca. So some basic information, and we'll go into a bit more detail as we go through the presentation, but this is for us a kind of a middle of the range harvest date, and we harvest around September 18th, depending on the year. It's very hardy, and we'll talk a little bit about the data that support that statement. Again, also disease resistance, some limited phylloxera infestation of the foliar form, and most importantly, the characteristic that is probably more critical is that the high quality fruit chemistry leading to dry style white wine production, which is different than Frontenac Blanc or Frontenac Gris, and also different from some of the other Labrusca type varieties that are grown here in Minnesota and other cold climate regions. I want to just point out the pedigree for Itasca because I think it's pretty interesting, and this is actually a shortened version of it showing about 6 generations. And the great thing about grape breeding is that we have fantastic records of the grape breeding process that had started in the middle of the 19th century in the United States and across Europe, primarily those breeding efforts in response to developing disease resistance and pest resistance vines that we can trace the pedigree. As you can see, Frontenac Gris and MN1234 are the parents, but in the background are other things like Thull, which is contributing powdery mildew resistance, VR Blanc, both of these contributing, I suppose, also some more of the vinifera type characteristics of the wine. But the cold hardiness, I think, is coming in from these 2 parents that I've highlighted on the far left. 2 different Vitis riparia sessions were used in these pedigrees, Riparia Minnesota 89 and Riparia Minnesota 39. And like I said, I think the benefit there is that they're each contributing maybe something slightly different for winter hardiness, which comes out in the 1285, which makes it stand out for primary bud survival even stronger than Frontenac Gris, which is just getting one source of this cold hardiness, the cold hardiness traits.
Okay, I think everybody should be able to hear me, correct? I'm unmuted.
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay. This is John Thull speaking, and good morning or good afternoon to you all, wherever you may be right now. We'll cover the next characteristics of the vine, Itasca. And it's like we've been talking about.
Hey, John, I have some feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, just make sure just one microphone is on and the other is muted if you have 2 close by.
Okay. Let's see if this should be okay now, huh?
Yeah, that's much better.
All right. So its hardiness was really stood out in the 2014 polar vortex year. That was that January of 2014. We had a pretty tough cold spell, and it seemed to come through relatively well during that. Not completely unscathed, but it did come through head and shoulders above other things in comparison. We'll talk about some of the pruning methods for the vine and how it shows great disease resistance relative to a lot of things. And we'll talk about its typical shoot growth and how its growth habit is very seems to be open and manageable. And also the vine, we'll talk a little bit about its vine spacing, because according to its vigor, depending on the site that you're working with, you might be thinking about keeping it at 6-foot spacing versus 8-foot spacing if you've got a more organic matter type of soil. And we'll talk about that fruit exposure. So, Matt, are you still advancing the slide, or can I do that now? Let's see. Okay, cool. So here we just wanted to show a cross-section of a bud, and this is what we're typically doing when we are checking our relative bud hardiness of these vines. We'll take canes that are about 8 buds long, and we will dissect those buds with a cross-sectional cut, checking both the primary and secondary buds that are in there. There is a tertiary bud hiding, but we don't need to necessarily check that guy. If the primary and secondary are alive, we know it's good to go. And in the case of Itasca, we always well, we typically see this very vibrant green looking buds underneath there, underneath the scope. So it's clearly really alive in our Minnesota winters most seasons. For example, this last season, it came through really nicely again. So maybe we have some data on that, but I think you can advance the slide to the next one. Here we go. So we did have a little bit of a cold snap in last December, which would have been December 2016. But on January 5th, then I pulled some canes out of the field and let them warm up, and then checked them just preliminarily. Normally we check these things in March. And what I saw at that point already, even though we had dropped down to around -25 earlier in that winter, on January 5th, they were still 98% alive on those buds. So, and that toughest test, like I talked about, was that polar vortex event. And you can see down there where we have MN 1285 as showing the highest bar. That was about 30. Oh, my screen just popped off here.
Hey, sorry about that. Not sure why it's, let's see here. Let me make,
I'll try to.
All right, Matt, so you should have presenter status again. I'm not sure why it did that.
Yeah. Excellent. We're back.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about
Yep,
that, guys.
sorry about that.
No problem. So, you know, even its parent Frontenac Grape right next to it, that was sitting at around 25, maybe around 30% on average bud survival. But the 1285 was, due to those two cold hardy parents, was hardier in that case. So, and you can see some of the others across the board. Castell is sort of like, it's a very weak and tender vine for us in Minnesota, and that one was completely squashed to the ground that year. So, all right, next slide, Matt, please. So, in looking at the vine Itasca, it gives you lots of good pruning options, which is really nice. And these are, it puts on very long, straight, beautiful canes with very few tendrils for the most part. It does have a little bit of tendrils going on, but for the most part, it's a nice, slender canes, and it does have relatively long internodes in some cases due to some of its vigor. So you can see that in the vine and some of the next shots that come up. Let's advance to this one. Here's a shot of the vine. This would be probably one of the older vines that we have of Itasca, and it gets to a point where it does put on a lot of growth. And some years we will choose to put some kicker shoots on there, or kicker canes, where you have shoots coming from the trunk lower down, helping to divert some of that energy out of the vine before it all gets fed up to the top of the vine. So you can see there, the white arrow is pointing to a kicker cane or a kicker shoot, and on the other side too, there's a kicker cane. Next one. And then when we do come to pruning, we're generally pruning those back to the trunk. We're pruning those kicker canes off, and in fact, they could have gotten pruned off during the season, the previous season as well. There's some practice where you would prune that energy off of the vine earlier as well. So we're just trying to find ways to help devigorate the vine or keep the vine in balance with all that. But basically, it has a really nice, you can do nice spur pruning with it, if you like, on a cordon. And it takes very well to cane pruning as well. The canes, those buds are reliably hardy, and you have every bud. If you're saving a cane that's, you know, in the normal range of 8 to 12 nodes long, just about every one of those buds is bound to perform and produce nice shoots with the clusters of fruit. So, and here, there's once in a while, if you happen to get a gap in your cordon where there's a couple of spurs that might have failed or something, or if you feel like you want to put a little extra fruit on with your vine, with the cordon, we do this cane and spur combination from time to time. You can see the shot above where it's just after pruning and tied up. And then once the shoots get growing, this is about 4 to 6 inch shoot stage, everything starts to fill in nicely, and you can see those clusters forming there. All right. And so this, I've been trying to contemplate with this aging cordon system, is there a way to help devigorate the vine or limit some of its reserves by sticking with cane pruning, and I've been playing around with it on the VSP trellis system a little bit. So is there some merit to doing some yearly cane renewal some way, even if it's not on necessarily on VSP, if you're still doing a high wire system, you might want to play around with doing some of the cane renewal systems. I think in the next shot here. So this is what I've been playing around with it on a VSP system, and you could also be doing this with your high wire system as well, where you're not allowing a permanent cane or a permanent cordon to form. You would be laying down fresh canes every single season onto those wires, and this is really the first variety that I've seen that gives you that ability to have these reliable buds every single year. You can just see them along the wire there. And I did leave 2 canes each direction, both on the vine to the left, which is an arched or bowed type of cane system, and then the other one's on the vine on the right that has the flat canes there. You can see both cases have 2 canes tied together. And I do this because of those longer internodes. If you're getting internodes on this guy that are more than 4 inches long, it's quite a bit of distance from node to node, and that way the shoots then have quite a bit of spacing. So if I want to make sure my bud count is still in that range of 6, if I want to have 6 shoots per foot of trellis, you can do this. You can still achieve that by laying the 2 canes together. Otherwise, cordons, generally you have more options with spurs and getting more buds fed in there. All right, so, but basically the main point is whatever you want to grow, however you want to grow the vine, you want to achieve that balance through the pruning every single year. And you're just going to have to watch this guy to make sure that you're keeping him in balance, because he does get off to the races pretty quickly, especially in those first early years. So just be aware that when you're putting that vine in the ground, that you're leaving enough buds to control that vigor, and then you can take enough buds off throughout the season. So pruning is the first step in that, of course, but then later, leave yourself some options with shoots, maybe along the trunks, like we talked about those kicker canes, and yeah, we can control the vigor through all of that. This is just a shot of some of the vines emerging and propagating in the greenhouse. The shoot tips generally come out very nice and fuzzy, full of hair, like you see on the leaves there, and then that leafy, or that little hairy plant hair basically sort of disappears in the next weeks to come. So in the next shot here, you can see how these leaves start to get really nice and glossy, and they look generally really, really green and healthy when they're well taken care of, I guess, and when they're in most soil environments, they seem to just perform really nicely like this. So you can see that lobing as well. It's a very good characteristic for identifying that you've got Itasca vines, is they've got these deeply sinused, or you get some lobes, you get some shape to the leaf. And here is a shot of the Itasca and comparing it with Marquette's bud break. Basically, these vines are of the same age, so the Marquette at this stage, this was a shot from May 4th, but 2016, and the Itasca was just a touch behind in bud break and bud swell and everything compared to Marquette. So that kind of gives you an idea of where it's coming in. I guess it sort of fits in between Frontenac and Marquette as far as bud break goes, or bud swell. So, and then the next shot here, I just happened to be looking at those same vines 1 full year later, and I snapped some photos. And here you can see we moved into the spur pruning because we've got cordons established with those 2 vines. And there they look relatively the same at this point. So I would say it still does come in a touch later. Itasca does bud out just a touch later than Marquette, but they're relatively on the same page as each other. So here you see some of the early shoot growth of Itasca with canes. Again, this is on a high cordon system now where I've got basically 2 canes laid out on the wire there, and they're starting to grow up very nicely and very reliably. Every single bud is just working there. Next one. And here is another vine, high cordon, with some spur pruning. And those spurs were left to be about anywhere from 2 to 4 nodes or 4 buds in length. And they're all also performing very nicely with the nice fruit clusters forming there and the shoots forming and just sort of ready to grow. So next shot here. The vine of Itasca, it seems to have just a touch of upright growth. It follows this for a while in the springtime, but of course, like everything, if it doesn't have catch wires to catch it, it is going to start to drape down later on in the season a little bit. But here's a shot where it's at 12 to 14 inches, and the shoots are still sort of reaching upward toward the sky, but they will come down with some weight. And here you have that shot where by mid-season, July, those clusters are starting to form nicely, becoming pea-sized, and the shoots have gotten heavy, and everything is combed down and very nicely hanging there, still with good exposure on that fruit. And that cleanliness, this is with very minimal sprays, because at the research center here, we really try to run the vines through the ringer without doing a lot of sprays, and I've gotten away some years with just basically 1 spray on this guy, and it can come through looking about this clean. So I wouldn't say it's completely organic or a vine that, well, maybe in some cases it could be grown organically, but the point is it is very clean leaves. It's got good resistance to a lot of the diseases, to a lot of the fungal diseases that are out there. And yeah, here's more on the pest resistance. Maybe Matt, you want to chime in on about it all?
Sure. So something that we've identified for pest resistance is that it appears that we do get some modest infestations for like powdery mildew, and our genetic testing has shown that it has the resistance gene called REN3 that's been inherited from Saval Blanc. And something just to point out is that Lance Cadle-Davidson, who's out in New York, has told us that the resistance that they have for REN3 has failed in New York, but that resistance does hold true here in Minnesota, at least in our research property. So when we think about, in general, about releasing these disease-resistant vines of any kind, and Itasca being one of them, is that there's a bit of an arms race between the pathogen population that's growing on each site and the plants that are growing there, and they're competing with each other in terms of how these resistance genes hold up over time. So although we see that powdery mildew is low on Itasca here in Minnesota, those same vines are going to perform very differently for powdery mildew resistance in different environments, especially in New York, where the pathogen race has changed. I know that's a bit more plant pathology than anybody probably wants to hear about, but it's something to keep in mind. If you're going to grow these vines and think about a reduced spray program, we should have some serious conversations with your extension folks to really think about what the best strategy is to keep populations of pathogens and even insect pests like phylloxera at bay so that they don't overcome this resistance. So we did see, or have seen, some of these other pests. So a little bit of black rot we saw in 2016. And then in terms of phylloxera resistance, it appears that it is genetically resistant to the foliar form of phylloxera, which is could be a major issue for things like Frontenac that get high levels of infestation. In our vineyard, where we're not spraying for or controlling for phylloxera, the Itasca plants perform really well. We see a few strikes, a few galls that form, but compared to the Frontenac ones that are close by, hardly any infestation. So that's one advantage to this variety as well. One thing that we don't know in general is whether getting phylloxera on the leaves is having any effect on yield. So that's something that our lab group is studying and planning to get some more information on, especially for Frontenac, and hopefully we'll be able to report back to you in the next year or two about some of those results. For downy mildew, it's something that we really haven't seen on the leaves or the fruit for Itasca, which I think is really great compared to something like La Crescent, which for us in 2016, our plants were decimated. The leaves were really heavily infected and actually had quite a bit of defoliation going into fall. We didn't have that problem at all with Itasca for downy mildew.
Yep, I'm back on here, I think. Just another shot of the vine showing its fairly vigorous growth, yet open growth of Thull. Those canes, again, with those little bit longer internodes, generally has leaves that are spaced well and far enough apart that the leaf thinning or the leaf removal that you might have to do to expose that fruit is fairly minimal. So yeah, it's kind of nice that way. So let's see what do we have in the next shot here. In this shot, you can see, I mean, there had been some leaf removal going on, and probably last season was one of our wetter seasons that we've ever seen in Minnesota. I mean, it was just downpouring rain especially throughout August, and I feel like some of that that excessive moisture and then a little bit of excessive leaf pulling in some parts of some of our vines led to some of the skin breakdown that you see in that bottom corner shot where the red arrow is pointing. Some of those berries did get a little bit of softness going on, and with that ultra exposed fruit then in that combination of wet, we did see a little bit of skin breakdown from sun scald basically. But for the most part, a lot of those berries look really nice and golden colored and holding up very well. Next shot is, yeah, this is kind of a typical scene of the vine over the last few years. The vine, they just get this beautiful golden hue, and they start ripening. Well, the veraison is, you know, about mid-August or so, and then they continue to ripen for the next month. And so by mid-September, you're in our area in Minnesota anyway, we're really starting to look and consider harvesting this guy, especially once it reaches about 25 bricks, and we'll talk about some of that fruit chemistry coming up. And this, sorry about this shot, is a little bit fuzzy, but it just does exemplify that it does get a little bit of basal leaf magnesium deficiency, which you can see here with that interveinal type of yellowing going on. It's different from the potassium deficiency that you might see on a dry year, and this, again, remember, was on a very wet season, on a very wet year, so the competition for magnesium and potassium is sort of determined by the moisture of the soil, and it seems like in this case the potassium was coming into the plant easily, but the magnesium was outcompeted, and you got this little bit of basal leaf. It's not a problem. I mean, if you want to do a little foliar amendments, it's possible, or fix the soil by doing some broadcast, but basically this clears up, and it's the basal leaves that are affected. The further leaves out further on the shoot are still looking good if we would zoom out of this shot. And here again, just kind of showcasing what a typical cordon with spur pruning vine could look like. This is a fairly young cordon in this case, but it's got that nice open growth, and this was very minimal shoot adjustment, I guess. The shoots kind of came down naturally like that for the most part, and the leaf removal was fairly minimal in this shot. So if you space out your buds properly when you're pruning and through shoot thinning early in the season, this is the type of effect that you can get relatively easy without a lot of work. All right, Matt, you want to take it again?
Sure. So I just wanted to talk just briefly about some characteristics from the data that we've collected, comparing Itasca to the other varieties that might be grown in the Midwest or other parts of the country. So just thinking about yield, we converted these to pounds, so hopefully I did my calculations correctly. But we did the yields on a per vine. We aren't really capable of extrapolating to beyond that. We don't have as many vines to estimate for an acre, for example, but about just under 12 pounds per vine for Itasca, which is a bit lower than Frontenac Gris or La Crescent, but certainly puts on a bit more yield than Marquette or Brianna. In terms of harvest window, I gave a whole range, which has been calculated over about 7 years. The earliest that we've picked is September 12th, and the latest September 28th. And compare that with Frontenac Gris, for example. We will push harvest dates pretty late on the Frontenac, mostly because we're trying to get those acids, excuse me, acid levels to come down. And so by that late October date for Frontenac Gris, those berries are pretty raisined up at that point. That's not something that we'd recommend for Itasca. Picking them at their peak ripeness would certainly make more sense. We don't have to worry about the acids, and just also worry about berry breakdown maybe happening after that, or maybe even some shattering maybe could be a problem. So you can see we pick and test harvest for these varieties over pretty large windows, but the timing for Itasca sort of falls the same place as Marquette. I think our average harvest date actually is about September 22nd or 23rd. So of course that's year dependent and site dependent, but that's where we're seeing it here in Minnesota. Just a little bit more about the fruit. This picture really captures this unique characteristic about Itasca. We see that it produces, each cluster will produce maybe 1 or 2 of these rosy colored berries. So bright pink, great visual indicator that your fruit are ripe or near ripeness. Of course, in the vineyard, you want to be looking at those chemistry parameters and also tasting your fruit to make your harvest decisions. But at the same time, we kind of call it like our turkey timer. You know, it pops up and turns pink. We know that this is a good time to really assess the fruit and determine that now might be a great time to be harvesting. In terms of flavors of the fruit, the descriptors that come up pretty commonly are things like pear, gooseberries, melons, specifically honeydew melon, star fruit. So it's got a lot of these great fresh fruit, some of those subtle, more subtle fruit quality characters that make it really interesting on the fruit and actually pretty darn tasty to eat during harvesting. So as Jenny says, it'll entice you to keep snacking while you're harvesting and maybe make that harvesting process a little bit more fun than Frontenac, for example, which is high in acid. These are pretty tasty and fun to eat. Here's a picture showing some top-notch clusters that we've harvested. Again, just to point out that beautiful golden hue that John had mentioned. There's a little bit of shrivel in some of these clusters, but just showing that also we're picking them pretty high Brix levels, 25% or so, and so if things creep a little bit higher than that, you start to see some of that raisioning going on. And again, just more pictures of what these clusters look like in the bin, and you can pick out those red, rosy-colored berries on most of the clusters that are here in this bin. The cluster shape, again, you can see is not too compact that the berries are pushing on one another, which might cause them to rupture. They're not as loose, though, as a cluster of La Crescent or Frontenac. So the internode link on the rachis is a little bit shorter, so we get these nice long clusters. Some of them will have a shoulder or a wing on them. And a pretty nice example of that phenomenon here is this single cluster with these almost 2 equal-sized clusters, one being a shoulder and the other being that main cluster there. So really, in our opinion, pretty nice looking clusters. Again, we don't see any shot berries in here. We don't see any disease. We don't see downy mildew. We're not experiencing rots unless we have some other sort of breakdown happening because of the weather events like John and Jenny mentioned. We really think that Itasca will be a grower-friendly vine. John mentioned that it appears to be pretty vigorous, but we're working on which techniques are best to deal with that issue. But equally important, it's a winemaker's grape. And primarily that's due to the juice chemistry that we're seeing. We have been harvesting in the range between about 25 to 28 bricks. So that's, really pretty high for compared to vinifera, for example. So we get a lot of sugars occurring naturally in these berries, which provides a little bit of flexibility in terms of winemaking. The pH ranges in this juice from just over 3 to 3.3, well within the range of normal winemaking parameters. The real critical thing here is the amount of total titratable acidity that we're seeing. And it ranges for us, excuse me, and it depends, of course, on the year, but we see between 9.5 and 10.5 grams per liter. And this may still seem high compared to some of the vinifera varieties that might average around 6 grams per liter. But this is a good 30% or more lower than its Frontenac Gris parent. So we think that the winemaker is going to be able to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the wine styles that they make, and have some fewer challenges in making a low acid wine, especially as those sugars are getting converted into alcohol. We're not left with this acid sort of bomb. Clusters range in size between 95 to 145 grams per cluster. They're not huge, but you've seen some of the pictures. Still really nice looking, and if you space your buds nicely on that trellis and prepare yourself, you can get a really good fruit set. I wanted just to compare some of these fruit juice quality traits across different Minnesota cultivars, just to reiterate some of the big differences we're seeing. So if we just go down the second column there looking at bricks, here's just some average harvest data. The sugars are very, very comparable to Frontenac Gris in that just over 24.5 range. For Frontenac, Frontenac Gris, a bit higher than La Crescent, and then also pretty comparable to Marquette. More critically, again, is that TA, or the total titratable acidity in grams per liter. You can see even when Itasca is performing a little bit higher on its grams per liter, it's still about a third less than Frontenac, Gris, La Crescent, and falls below Marquette. And then pH, although variable, falls within a normal winemaking range, despite having a little bit lower total acidity. Part of the reason that we see differences in acidity is the amount of malic acid in the juice sample. So I've highlighted within this table in red some different amounts of malate in grams per liter. And you can see that Itasca comes in at about, of that total 10 grams per liter of acids that it produces, about 3 grams of that are in malic acid, which has a perception in the mouth of being a stronger acid, a bit more sour tasting than some of the other acids like tartaric acid that makes up another large percentage of the total acidity there. So comparatively, there's about 50% less malic acid in a liter of juice compared to Frontenac Gris. So excuse me, the total acids are lower, but also the amount of malic acid in that sample is also lower. So I didn't include too much about tasting notes, because those things are certainly subjective, just like the flavors that we're getting in the vineyard, but some of the same flavor profiles carry through into the wine. So we get notes of pear and quince. Some people have commented about the minerality or the aromatics of violets. Again, melons carry through from what we're tasting in the berry to in the wine, and also subtle honey notes. So we've been talking a bit about the juice characteristics. I wanted to present just a little bit of data about what the final wine looks like. And the interesting column here is probably the fourth column, the TTA. Again, just looking at the grams per liter, the amount of acids in that sample. And you can see that Itasca comes in. So some of those acids are metabolized through the winemaking process. And so we come down with an average grams per liter about 7.6 grams in the wine sample itself. Still less, again, than Frontenac or La Crescent. A little bit higher than Brianna, which is kind of our outgroup in looking at white varietals that people might be growing at the same time. The big difference there, of course, with these acids being similar, the difference between Itasca and Brianna would be Brianna has the Labrusca notes because of that species in its background. And then the acids are a bit higher than Marquette in this case. So that concludes some of the data that we wanted to present and show you some images about Itasca. And of course, we would be remiss. We mentioned a lot of people at the beginning of the presentation who've worked on this project. In the last couple of years, we also have a number of students and technicians and also international students who contribute to this project. So I wanted to make sure to acknowledge those as well. So I won't read everyone's name, but just also note that on staff we have Drew Horton, who's our enologist, who's working on helping to identify the best way to make wines from this and the other experimental varieties that we're working on. Vines are available. The University of Minnesota has developed licensing agreements currently with 3 vineyards, AA vineyards in New York, Northeastern Vine Supply, and Winter Haven Vineyard and Nursery. So if you're interested in purchasing these vines, we would suggest that you contact these licensed nurseries so that you can get those ordered. I'm not sure if they have any more availability in 2017, but you certainly should be in touch with them if you have more information about attaining vines. For more information, you can certainly head to our websites. We try to maintain a blog at enology.umn.edu. We don't always have the most timely information going up there, but we'd like to keep people up to date of the progress on different things we're working on. And also our Minnesota Hardy website lists some information about the different varieties and their cultural characteristics. But thanks to Tim Martinson, we don't have a Itasca one up on that website yet. So that's a goal for us, is to really get that information on there so that if you're growing any of the Minnesota developed varieties, there's one place where you can go and get the information about cultural practices, juice chemistry, wine chemistry, and its attributes. If you'd like to join our email list, there's a website there where you can go to that, and we can also send out timely information to you there. And without further ado, that concludes our presentation, and we've allowed quite a bit of time to answer questions, and John and Jenny will hopefully be able to answer those. So for now, I'll turn it over to Alex. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, John, and Jenny. I'm excited to try some if I come across some Itasca in New York. So we have a lot of comments coming in, and Jenny and John have both been great about answering some of your questions already throughout the presentation. Just make sure that if you do have questions, type them in the chat bar and make sure you have that set to everyone so we can all see your questions. All right, so let's see, I'll go back through a couple of these here. So we've had a couple of questions about availability. Jenny, feel free to chime in. You wrote that the wine has not been made on a commercial level and that the vines are just getting sent to growers.
Yes. People are just going to be getting their vines actually pretty soon on a commercial level from a couple of those places that Matt talked about. Andy Farmer, New York, and as well as Ray Winter here. So they're just going to be put into the ground this year, and hopefully we'll be tasting some of that wine in three or 4 years or so on a commercial level.
Great. So we have a couple other questions coming in. Let's see. Sylvian is asking for any suggestions on how to winterize the let's see here, winterize the wine. Sylvian, feel free to clarify that. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we'll come back to that question. Eugene asked, is there any need to cluster thin?
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Cluster thin, probably not too much need to cluster thin. In fact, I would put clusters of fruit on that guy on Itasca as soon as you can. I mean, we've grown a vine in 1 year. It can produce quite a bit of shoot growth, and I've put fruit on it on that second year already just to help hold it back. So I don't feel like it needs a lot of cluster thinning. It's not like the Frontenacs, which can almost overcrop because typically they'll put on, 3, if not 2 clusters for sure, but sometimes the Frontenacs will throw 3 clusters, even a little tiny 4th cluster per shoot in some rare cases. This Itasca is much more subdued and much more like 2 clusters per shoot, and in order to balance that shoot growth that's going on, you definitely want to put more fruit on it if you can find ways to do that. So yeah, don't drop fruit is probably what I would say. It's similar to Marquette then, which can be less productive in the vineyard compared to the Frontenacs. And like some of the other webinars that have been talking about high cordon versus VSP, I feel like you probably can coax more fruit out of the high cordon train system versus VSP. But I am trying to play around with that, and that's part of the canes approach. Is typically you can get nicer fruit set from those buds that are at node position 4, 5, 6, and beyond. Up to node 12. You generally get very nice clusters formed out of those shoots versus the spur. When you do spur buds, there's generally smaller shoots, smaller initials of fruit held in those buds, and you therefore typically get smaller clusters. And then to make that point even worse, putting it on VSP generally reduces those clusters again because you've got that shoot apical dominance going on and kind of competing against the cluster size. So and the jury's still out which way you want to grow it. If you do favor VSP in your vineyard, it totally will work in VSP systems. But if you're thinking about the productive side of things and managing it in a nice way, the high cordon system is very good for it as well. And Jenny and I have our little battles between us, which way we want to grow it. So maybe she can talk to the VSP side of it a little bit more. No, good.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Feel free to chime in.
I really like. Are you okay? I really like it on VSP. We just have some young vines right now, so they, of course, they're really going to look nice at this stage. But I really like working on VSP. I think it's a little bit more grower friendly. So I'm really crossing my fingers that it does pretty well with that cane system on VSP.
Great. So we had a question earlier from Jason who asked if there were any other experimental plots planted outside of Minnesota. And he wrote, I'm curious what kind of numbers you'd get for yourself. So you briefly mentioned that in the comments, but if in those other plots, what are you seeing for fruit composition?
I can respond to that. This is Matt. So I would say that the pipeline for getting this variety into market maybe went faster than getting the experimental plats established in some southern vineyards. So we have sent out vines last year to collaborators at, I want to say, 10 different places. So we're still waiting to get some of that information. So I really can't respond today about that. We have had people growing these vines in different locations in Minnesota. And then the best data might come from other northern tier places. So these nurseries that are growing it, we're also have been making observations for quite some time on these plants, but we're not going to know how they're doing in Indiana or Illinois or Missouri for another 2 years or so.
Okay, great. So Sylvian responded to that question earlier. She's asking for any suggestions on winterizing the plants in hard winter regions, and she's writing from Quebec.
I'm sorry, is the question, do they need any additional protection?
Sure, yeah, or if you have any suggestions for colder regions. Tim did respond, this seems to be more hardy than Frontenac, so it shouldn't require
I would
agree.
agree. I would say I thought Quebec was a zone equivalent to us or even warmer than us here in Minnesota, but I don't know that as a fact. I don't think they need to be buried. If you can grow Frontenac there, they don't need to be buried. I should point out that the vines are not available in Canada, so that shouldn't be a concern at the moment.
Okay, and that was another question earlier, so thank you for clarifying.
We are working for establishing plant variety protection in Canada, so we hope to proceed with that still this year. The plants right now are going through a Clean Plant Center in Prosser, just for their traditional virus testing before they can go into export market.
Great. Tim, I've noticed you've had a couple comments. Feel free to jump in here if you'd like.
Really no need. I don't remember what I commented about.
Okay.
But I will comment that the clusters look an awful lot like Vidal Blanc, and it's striking that maybe this might be something that is pretty close to Vidal Blanc in terms of some of its characteristics. No, that's all. I can't remember what else I wrote here.
Hey, Tim, maybe something that you commented on was umbrella Niffen as a training system.
That's right, yes.
Is there something that you want to comment more specifically about?
Yeah, one of the things that caught my ear was number one, John saying that maybe the base, the lower nodes were a little bit less fruitful, produced smaller clusters and so forth. So that's kind of an argument for cane pruning, or longer spurs. And then the other one was the long internodes. So traditionally with Concords and native grapes, that's one of the ways you get around having long internodes is to arch the canes up and down, and therefore you fit more buds in less space. And so that might be a way of dealing with the vigor.
Yep. If you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, that's Tim. I agree with that. I think that would be pretty interesting to put it on that the umbrella Niffen type of training style. So, and it's not that the basal buds, they do produce nicely. I mean, the node 2, 3, and 4, you can get really nice fruit out of those for sure. But the canes are so nice and clean and so reliable. That's the real trick. It's the variety that I've seen that just it drives right through that winter and it comes through in the spring with most of those buds beautiful and green and everything. So I feel like if you want to keep your vines clean and looking and very open, the cane pruning is one of those things that can achieve that for you. And then on top of it, you get beautiful fruit exposure during the season. It's less of there's probably less shoot thinning that has to go on and less canopy combing with the canes versus cordons.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. So John, while you're on, we have a question from Amy. Can you talk a little bit more about vine spacing recommendations?
Sure. If you're going to go with the vine on a high wire system and then let it go into cordons, like we traditionally are doing, it can fill an 8-foot space relatively easily, and especially if your soils are fairly fertile to begin with, I would probably leave it spread its wings out into 8-foot panels. I have a vineyard that's in central Minnesota, and it's a little bit more rocky type of a soil. It is fairly fertile. It was farmland for many, many years. And I guess I don't have Itasca growing there, but I have my other vines that are growing there, like Frontenac and Frontenac Gris and Marquette and La Crescent, and they're doing very nicely on my 6-foot spacing. But I'll be looking to trial some Itasca on 6-foot spacing as well. So if you're on a more sandy gravel site, you're more prone then to doing the 6-foot spacing. And then again, if you're choosing between canes and cordons, the tighter spacing for the canes is what would be recommended. And if you're going into cordon territory, then you got to give it a little bit more space. So I hope that kind of answers that question.
Great. So Dorothy wrote, do you think it's capable of producing more yield than 3 tons per acre?
Yes, I think if you're, you know, doing the pruning the way you can coax out that fruit and leaving the right amount of buds and everything, it should be able to push beyond 3 tons per acre. But it's not going to be as heavy producing as the Frontenac family. So if anybody is used to how heavy Frontenac and Frontenac Gris can produce, it is a little bit more on par with Marquette's production versus the Frontenac production. So just be aware of that. Okay.
I would comment, however, though, that compared to Marquette, it's certainly more winter hardy. So you're depending on how you're calculating your yields, you're going to have hopefully more fruitful vines in that space than in Marquette, for example.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time. If any of the participants have additional questions, I'll include my email address in the chat box before we leave, and you can feel free to email me, and I can forward those to Matt and John and Jenny. So with that, thank you again to Matt Clark and Jennifer and John Thull. I really appreciate your excellent presentation. There's some great information on Minnesota's newest grape, and I hope that all the participants will find this very useful too. So slides and a recording from today's webinar will be posted on the Northern Grapes Project website by the end of the week. And as another reminder, the Northern Grapes Project webinar series has concluded for this season, and we would like to take the time to thank all of our sponsors who've made this possible, as well as Mike White's fundraising efforts to keep the webinar series going for the 2016 and 2017 season. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for their interest and support. Make sure to visit our Facebook page for updates on the Northern Grapes Project, and feel free to email me any additional questions, and I can do my best to forward those to Matt or also post on our Facebook page. So thank you again for our participants and for the presenters, and have a great day. Matt and John and Jenny, I'll see you again tonight at 6 p.m. your time.
Yep, thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Okay, thank you. Great job.
Thanks, Tim. See ya.